Are you still nervous and unsure about how to incorporate watercolor in your nature journal? Are you afraid of using watercolor in the field? Right now, I'm going to show you a couple easy and hard ways to use watercolor in your nature journal. Wow, that's beautiful. I can never do that, capture that on the page. Luckily, there's an easy way to do it. You don't have to worry about capturing the whole landscape. What if you just used your watercolor to capture the colors in your nature journal pages? Making little color swatches and trying to match the colors that you see in the environment around you is one of the easiest ways to get started with watercolor in your nature journal. Notice how I'm also making notes of the pigments that I'm using, and the whole point of doing multiple squares is to see how that pigment looks with more and more water as it gets faded. You can also try different mixes of your colors and putting some colors on top of each other. Right now I'm trying to capture the ice plant colors that have green and pink, and I'm also trying to see what color mixes make the best sky and ocean. This is the easiest way to get started, and this kind of watercolor could go next to your black and white drawings or other notes that you're already doing in your nature journal. Another way to use watercolor in your nature journal that I really enjoy is landscapitos, little landscape drawings. And watercolor is a perfect way to add color and context to the places that you visit. A lot of times people do this by doing an underdrawing with ink or with pencil. I really like this gray ink because it kind of disappears when the watercolor goes over it. So this is almost like a coloring book style of using watercolor, and some people use that in a derogatory way. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and it's a lot of times easier to do an underdrawing as a sort of plan. With watercolor, you really need a plan more than you do with other types of paint. Another thing about watercolor is you have to do this in stages a lot of times. So while this is drawing, I might do something else like including swatches right next to my painting, or testing colors, or taking notes about the plants and animals I see. So doing these types of watercolor landscapitos or landscape paintings is really complementary to your other types of nature journaling. Just like anything else, it does take practice, so it's a lot harder than doing the swatches, but you'll get better the more you do it. Most people do an underdrawing underneath their watercolor landscapes and plants and animals, but it is possible to go direct to watercolor in your nature journal. If you haven't tried it before, give it a try. It is a lot harder. I started with this base layer, and then as you can see, I reverted back to doing watercolor swatches again, because these swatches are really a useful learning tool, and it's a great thing to do while your paint is drying. Now you can see I'm using some of what I learned by doing those swatches on my other landscapes and going back in, adding some of the darks, and I'm also working on multiple watercolor paintings at a time. One of the things about using watercolor in your nature journal is you might as well have multiple paintings going at the same time, because you have to wait for them to dry. So you might as well be working on something else while one is drying. I think you can learn a lot faster this way as well, and the aesthetic effect of having multiple paintings on the same page is part of what makes nature journaling look so cool. One of the most common ways that people use watercolor in their nature journals is watercolor plant drawings. Like the landscapes, these are often with an underdrawing. So starting with an underdrawing with ink or a pencil is important. And as you can see, you can add notes and questions and do all those other things that make this nature journaling and not just botanical illustration. Some planning can be helpful to get the leaf shapes right. Even with ink, you can do this. As you just saw, I slightly outlined those shapes, putting in those words and those notes. And then last but not least, coming in with the watercolor. You can still achieve lots of fun watercolor effects even in this coloring book type style. Nothing wrong with coloring book style. I do think this makes the most sense for nature journaling. Here with this blackberry leaf, I'm trying to get that cool fade between purple and green, and watercolor is really a wonderful and fast way to do that. Look at how these came out. This isn't the easiest way to use watercolor in your nature journal, but it is one of the most common, the most fun, and the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. Back to another fun, easy, and creative way to use watercolor in your nature journal that a lot of people aren't taking advantage of. Look at all this leftover color that I have in my mixing areas. I have this blue left over from the ocean in my landscape. Why don't I use that to make some fun lettering? And lettering can be drawn first with ink or pencil, but it also looks really cool when you go straight with your watercolor brush and make some brush lettering. This is really fun, and it also creates a great effect. It's also very quick and the results are unique. Look at how easy it is to use this water brush to make this nice big lettering with very special personality. Watercolor works great inside of bubble letters as well. So easily with ink or with pencil, you can draw bubble letters like you do for your titles in your nature journal, and then you can add watercolor to them later. So let's see how we could use some of this watercolor lettering in a real example using those plants that we already drew and watercolored. This is an example of how I might put a title on this page and then use watercolor to color it in. This time, I'm not going to use leftover paints I have in my mixing areas. I'm going to choose paints specifically to go with the topic. So for this blackberry, I'm choosing this purple color. I mixed a little bit of Winsor violet with naphthalene maroon, and I'm going to make purple inside of the letters for that one. And then I'm going to a little bit use a random color for the brassica, but I really like this reddish naphthalene maroon mix for that one. Now let's get in close so you can see some of the subtleties of how watercolor can make this lettering fast and fun. So I'm making a pretty wet little wash right there, and when I put it in, I'm either tilting my sketchbook up a little bit or I'm ending my stroke at the bottom of those letters. You can also go back and add a little bit more at the bottom of the letters while it's still wet, and that creates a three-dimensional look and this sort of fading look towards the top. The bottom is darker and the top is paler, and you can really have fun with this. If you like watercolor effects, you know that watercolor can be a really powerful tool for creating these sort of gradients, and in your lettering, it will look really special. So try that out. Last but not least, you can add outlines after you do the lettering with the water brush. I use this one the least because I don't really like it as much, but it is an option and it's a good thing to experiment with, and maybe it will work better for you or in certain situations. So adding outlines with ink after you do the lettering with straight water brush is a good option to know about. Another very easy, fun, and creative way to get started with watercolor in your nature journal is to use it for borders, boxes, and highlights. You can do this after a nature journaling session, such as we just did with those plants, and add a little bit more composition. It's really good to use pale washes for this, and some people might use Tombow pens or other things, but look at how easy and fast it is with watercolor. I can also create an entire box, and maybe I could put text on top of this, or my text could go underneath as long as my ink, and this is really important, is a pigment type ink that is not water soluble. You can also use it for highlighting, so if there are special notes that you want to stand out, you can use watercolor for that. This is an example of how a little bit of a pink wash going behind those black and white drawings makes a big difference. Last, but definitely not least, and also definitely hardest, is using watercolor for animal drawings in the field while you're in the field using the watercolor. All of the drawings that I'm going to show you right now and those ones of the quetzals and toucans were done in the field, including the watercolor part. Once again, it is going to be sort of a coloring book technique that works best. So for example, I was here in Colombia seeing these orioles singing, and it was really cool, a cool species of oriole, and I tried to just capture it as quickly as possible. As you can see, I'm not really doing any sort of underdrawing planning with the bird. I'm going straight to ink. I'm also trying to capture a little bit about the sound, and then I'm going to add the watercolor. Making sure that your watercolor kit works well in the field, is easy to hold standing up. Those are the kinds of things that are going to make it possible for you to watercolor animals in the field. Also, I think that doing swatches and doing some of these other watercolor techniques in your nature journal are going to make you less afraid, and they're going to make you more confident in using watercolor and matching those colors when it comes time to capturing something like this, a real life animal that's moving. It's really challenging. So all that practice is going to make it possible. Those are some of the main ways to use watercolor in your nature journal. If you want an in-depth class with all kinds of tips and very specific techniques for doing watercolor landscapes in your nature journal, check out this class that I have on Skillshare. You can use this link right here to see what it's all about, and we go way in depth into some of this landscape painting stuff, including really fun classes based in the Galapagos Islands where I did this landscape painting right here.